Hey!
Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Baltenschuk. I'm the program director of the European Women's Lobby, and next to me is
Janina Raffo. I'm the Google Technology Policy Fellow here in the European Women's Lobby.
So, before Laura Fischer will join us and give us good insights into how to use storytelling for social transformation, like currently with regards to gender equality between women and men in Europe. So we, the European Women's Lobby, are the largest umbrella organization in Europe. We represent around and a little bit beyond, such as Turkey, Serbia, or Macedonia. We come together as women's rights organizations, feminists and activists to campaign for our vision of a feminist Europe, and we strongly believe in that we need a feminist Europe. So, however, even we made a huge progress in terms of equality between women and men in the past decades. And when we look back at the period, let me say, of 50 years, change happened. Definitely. I think we can all have more rights than our mothers had or their mothers had when we look back. However, not only across the world, but also in Europe, progress, according to the statistics, we had EGE, the European Gender Equality Institute, several weeks ago coming out again with their statistics with regards to gender equality in Europe, which again showed that we are stagnating. And we look at issues such as power, money, violence, access to education and health care, and a range of other different areas. However, we believe we have to scale and accelerate and ensure that women's rights are something that we all will live and experience, and see that gender equality is not just something in the far distance, but something that we hopefully can live once as well. And we believe strongly that storytelling is one of the tools and methodologies which can ensure that we can describe and talk about lived experiences of women on the ground, of the daily lives, what is really of importance for us as women and girls. And yeah, Laura will give us a good insight, I hope, in using storytelling for our work in campaigning, in advocacy, lobbying, and also in getting funding. And also, so to say, advocating for funding for women's rights. So I think now,
Janina, ready, right? So just a quick logistic things. You can leave any question you want in the little question box that you will have at your right, and Laura will be more than happy to make any like Q&A kind of like interaction with you guys. So we have the pleasure now to introduce Laura Fischer, which is a writer and actor for New York City. Also, she is like the right-hand woman of Gloria Steinem and the co-founder of Elle Productions, which is like a producing company. So Laura, welcome.
Hi there. I'm getting my video up and running, so hopefully you all can see me. After a little bit of a technical snafu, I think I'm up and running, but if anything starts getting funny, please send a little chat to Sarat and Janina, and thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to the European Women's Lobby for all that you do. Without you all, I don't know where Europe would be, and I know Gloria and I really, really depend on you all for all of our feminism in Europe information, so thank you. And thank you for giving me the space to talk about storytelling, which is something I can talk about forever. I won't do that today, so I'm just gonna jump right in. Bear with my mediocre PowerPoint skills. Right now, I'm gonna switch over so you can see my screen. and let's just dive in. So a very quick personal account of how I got here doing this webinar with you. Back in June, Gloria and I, as you know, I work for Gloria, we came over to Brussels. We had the honor of coming over and participating in the June meeting, joining the European Women's Lobby meeting last June. And I probably met many of you there, and if you weren't there, please go ahead and Google the European Women's Lobby, because they do some, like I said, some really great work. So all of their members were here in this same space. Imagine all these great activists here, and they're talking about what they love and everyone they're helping. And the whole time, my storytelling radar was going crazy. Gloria and I were hearing all of these great, oh, lost the PowerPoint. We were hearing all these great stories from meeting to meeting. The energy was incredible, and we kept thinking, oh, this would be a great film, or this would be the start to a great book. And then we got to the final meeting. I think it was a Saturday. And for those of you there, you remember that meeting, that green room, that great green room. And when we got to that meeting, something changed. It's like everyone, all these great members that were telling these great stories, put on their presentation faces, and the stories just disappeared. So when the members were standing up to speak to fellow members, and to this guy right here, Mr. Timmermans was there to listen and to show support. And it was as if everyone went to statistics. And I remember a very particular member standing up. And I have no recollection of where she was from, what she looked like, and more importantly, I don't remember a single fact she told us during her testimony. And I was actively trying to listen to show her respect that she deserved. But she became this blur, and my memory did not hold on to anything she was saying. So I thought I was tired, or maybe it was just my brain or jet lag. Maybe, I am different from people. Maybe just because I'm an actor or a writer, my brain wants a story, and I don't latch on to numbers. But then I looked around, and no one else was paying attention either. The entire audience, which was, most of you were probably more tired than I was, you were all distracted, chatting, zoned out, fidgeting, and even Timmermans was having a hard time listening. And it really bothered me, because this information really needs to get out there. You all need to tell this information to important people like Timmermans and to each other. So I started thinking about it and comparing it to, a day or two before that. And I remember Fiona Broadfoot. And if you were there, you remember her too. I remember her vividly. I remember her face. I remember the story she told, that she was exploited into prostitution at age 15. And now she helps girls in the UK in the same situation and those at risk. I remember very vividly where I was when I met Mina from Women Refugee Route, another great EWL member organization that you should look up if you don't know about what she does. Those faces, those stories are so clear in my mind. And in that sea of amazing women and activists, they stuck out to me. And I started to think, why? And then I realized it was stories. They were able to tell a good story. So at a dinner one night, I think it was, Sarap and I were talking, and she said, I think you should do a webinar on this. And so I said, okay, I'll think about it. Again, I have mediocre PowerPoint skills, as you'll see. But here I am, and I like Sarap, think it's a really important key to doing more for feminism and for the communities that you serve. So what exactly is storytelling? When I Google storytelling, I get the definition: the social and cultural activity of sharing stories. Oh, sorry. Keep taking you away from my screen. Okay, so that definition to me sounds good. That sounds about right. But then what are stories? According to Wikipedia, which we should never trust, a story is an account of imaginary or real people told for entertainment. And that for entertainment part throws me a little bit. This is where Wikipedia loses my vote of confidence. Are stories really only for entertainment? I certainly don't believe so. And I'm not alone. As my pal Gloria says, we learn from stories. We do not learn from statistics. If you hear a statistic, you will make up a story to go with it, because our brains are organized on narrative. And you may very well make up a wrong story because you only have one fact, which is a statistic. If you hear a story, you learn and retain it. Basically, if you want people to care, they have to empathize. And to empathize, they need to connect emotionally. And to connect emotionally, you need stories. So to me, storytelling and activism go hand in hand, because you are very likely very emotional people who care about what you're doing, and you're serving people who need your help. So if you can use storytelling, I think it can really help you in so many ways. You can stand out amongst the many other organizations that are out there. I mean, imagine how many organizations the Ford Foundation or Open Society or any of those big foundations hear about on a daily basis. A good story can help you and your organization stick out amongst that pile of applicants, or as they're trying to look for new organizations to give money to. Just like if Fiona Broadfoot emails Gloria and me, we remember her because of her story. Storytelling can grow your audience. Think about the Popular Humans of New York group on Facebook, and if you don't know who I'm talking about, please look them up, because that is a great example of very effective storytelling. The guy whose name I didn't look up, he started it. He goes around, he snaps a picture of someone and then tells a person stories with their own words, and it is a huge hit. It's huge. And I think, and hopefully you'll agree, that we are always searching for meaning in life, and stories help us understand and then navigate our own emotional complexities and further understand life experiences. So your audience wants that. Your audience wants to hear your stories that you can uniquely tell. Then, of course, storytelling can really help you attract donors, like I said, if you're applying for a grant. But also just on a personal level with your own current donors. The more they feel connected to you, the more they're going to remember you when it's time to write that check. And then through storytelling, you empower women. By telling those unique stories, you're empowering people who do not have a voice. I think of the really popular Me Too campaign right now that's going on. That happened because women started telling their stories. And now we have a movement, an online movement, because of those stories. And finally, as I hope you'll see through this webinar, storytelling is so powerful, and we're so hooked to story that you can use story to influence and change the world. I mean, you think of Malala telling her story, or if we go back in history and think of Uncle Tom's Cabin or To Kill a Mockingbird, two huge novels in the US that really influenced how people thought and made a change for the good. So let's go back and look at stories. As we all know, stories have been around for a very long time. We told story through art before we could speak. Eventually, we told stories through spoken word, and then we developed writing, and we wrote stories down, which we then published, and then we developed technology to create films and ads and poems and video games, and now virtual reality. Our lives are completely full of stories, whether we realize it or not. And even if all those external sources disappeared, if all of that went away, say we're on a deserted island by ourselves, our mind would still think in story, because story is the language of the brain. Why? Well, if we go back, before storytelling was a hip term, before you could watch a webinar on it or a TED Talk, about 70,000 years ago, something changed in humans' cognitive abilities. We don't really know why or how this change happened, but the most common theory argues that an accidental genetic mutation changed the inner wirings of our brains, enabling us being Homo sapiens, to think in unprecedented ways and to communicate with a new language. This cognitive revolution changed us in three big ways. First, like many other animals, we did have a vocal language. So we could warn our fellow humans with a call. We could say, careful, and another human would understand, oh, I should pay attention. But with these cognitive changes and advanced linguistic skills, we could string together more thoughts, and we could say not only, hey, careful, but we could say, hey, there's a lion back by that watering hole, maybe don't go over there and try to get water. And so obviously this extra information could mean the difference between life or death, and thus our population increased because we were able to better navigate the physical world. So that's one kind of story. Second, as social animals, we belong to a group. And nature realized that if we were going to thrive, we needed to learn to work together, to cooperate in large groups. Our brains didn't just change so that we could analyze new physical realities. Our brains grew and developed better social skills. Stories enabled us to decipher the far more intricate, invisible social world. As humans today will agree, it's much harder to understand what someone is feeling because you can't physically see it. But a story could give us a look at someone else's mind or experiences and give us insight into what makes people tick. And we could use gossip as a way to navigate these social nuances so necessary to thrive. But why is gossip, which we all think of as very negative, why is that important to us? I mean, before gossip and before our brains changed and we're able to create these stories, there are clear limits to the number of people we can intimately know. For example, chimpanzees, which were very much like our pre-Homo sapien ancestors, rarely have more than 100 chimps in their troop. Because once you reach, excuse us, our phone is ringing. Once you reach 150, chimps, or humans in this case, social scientists find that the social order destabilizes. But with gossip, we had a new way to spread information about humans, expanding our network of trust. So I can't know every person in my 500-person ancient settlement, but my brother can know a person that I don't know, and he can tell me that that person is trustworthy and an okay addition to the neighborhood. Even today, studies find that personal stories and gossip make up 65% of our conversations. So the point of all this is that gossip, these stories that we created, also helped us grow. We knew who to trust, we knew who to mate with, we knew who to befriend and who to avoid. But the most unique and important thing that developed and shot us to the top of the food chain was our ability to imagine worlds that didn't even exist. We were able to create fictions, we were able to create stories, and that's how we became the humans we are today. And when I say fiction, I'm not talking about fables and lessons necessarily when I say fiction. I'm going to read this quote from Harari, who wrote the great book Sapiens, and if you have not read it, please do. It's mind-blowing, and he's just a terrific writer. He says, much of history revolves around this question. How does one convince millions of people to believe particular stories about gods or nations or limited liability companies. Yet when it succeeds, it gives sapiens immense power because it enables millions of strangers to cooperate and work toward common goals. Just try to imagine how difficult it would have been to create states or churches or legal systems if we could speak only about things that really exist, such as rivers or trees or lions. I mean, think about how much of our society is built on story. He says it, religion, nations, legal systems, LLCs, they do not exist in the physical world. They only exist in our minds in story form. And this is the power of story. The stories of the Bible and the imagined idea, because let's face it, even if you are religious, you have to say there's no physical proof that heaven exists. So this invisible idea that you could go to heaven if you believed in X, Y, Z made a peasant in France and an aristocrat in Germany unite and find common ground to fight the Crusades or build a huge cathedral. The United States, the story of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which are invisible ideas, a story shared between a bunch of 18th century white men, is how the U.S. started. None of these imagined systems could exist without story, because you could not get a huge group of human beings to cooperate without a convincing story. Our whole history and present world would be so much, much different without story. So because story is healthy for us from an evolutionary standpoint, it's critical to our survival and growth as a species. Our brains are constantly searching for the narrative. A lot of studies are being done on storytelling in the brain. For example, the hormone cortisol is released during the rising arc of a good story, prompting a strong emotional response, even though we know it's fiction. And I think what's even more interesting is a study that tells us if we listen to, say, a PowerPoint presentation that has bullet points and numbers, data, statistics, everything that that member was presenting, certain parts in our brain do get activated. Scientists call these, and I'm going to probably mispronounce them, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Overall, it's hitting the language processing parts in the brain, where we decode words into meaning. And that's it. That's all that kind of gets lit up in our brain. But when we are being told a story, things change dramatically in our brain. Not only are the language processing parts in our brains activated, but any other part in our brain that we would use when experiencing the events of the story are too. So, in essence, when you hear a good story, you're not just the audience, you become a participant. Your brain is participating in the story, which is why it's so powerful. Stories can instill meaning directly into our belief system the same way experience does. Not by telling us what to think or what is right, but by allowing us to feel it ourselves. Stories have the ability to influence and to inspire large groups. I mean, think about it. Think of the social justice movements that you know of. It's hard to think of one that didn't come out of people starting in small groups, sharing their life stories, and discovering a connection. And yes, story can also be used for bad. Hitler is a prime example of when story was used to manipulate people. But I think most of us here really want to use story for good. And if we can understand stories and storytelling techniques, we can reach more people with our message. So how do we do that? How can we use storytelling to help your organization? Okay, so this is where we get a little more into the practical part if you want to pull out a notebook. Let's first talk about audience and purpose. For an activist, your audience is really going to be specific to what your organization or cause needs. So I imagine most of you, like almost any women's organization, needs funds. So, you know, like I said before, maybe you're applying for a grant, or maybe you're just trying to expand and appeal to new donors. Or do you need to expand your social media outreach, say by gaining more followers on Facebook? Or are you looking for teammates? Are you looking for volunteers and you want really dedicated people? A story can help you get those people. Your audience is really whoever you are trying to reach and inspire. And so think about that as we're going through this. Who do you really need to reach in the next few months with your work? And once you know that, your purpose is going to kind of become obvious. Once you know your audience, go ahead and write out your purpose, even if it's obvious. You know, we need more online donors, for example. Having a clear purpose will help you create the most effective story. You can always add on to this purpose, or you can change your purpose a little bit as you play and have fun and think of these stories. Another note that I want to mention is, since I am assuming most of you are activists, we're going to focus on success stories. We're not going to write a love story or a horror film. We want to show how your organization has been successful. And what exactly are we writing, you might ask? I mean, hopefully it's obvious, but some of you might be thinking, I can't not put a novel on our Facebook page. How can I use storytelling? And like I said before, maybe you have a speech or a panel coming up, and instead of stating statistics after statistics, you can create a story where you weave in those facts. So, for example, instead of listing the number of women activists imprisoned in Turkey over the last year, you tell the audience a story of one that we're about to go into. Will help you rewrite your website or do a better e-newsletter so that you can portray your organization in a more personal way. In the US right now, so many organizations are doing great work to get women, progressive women, elected to office. And that's excellent. We want lots of people to do that. But I feel blasted in my inbox by so many organizations. So my brain needs to sift through all of these emails, and the ones my brain goes to are the ones that focus on a specific candidate and tell her story. Anyway, so while we're working on these steps, think about how you could use story in your organization's outreach or messaging. Okay. Regardless of how you're going to use your story, there are really 3 basic elements to any successful story. And I'm pulling from someone named Michael Hauge. It's H-A-U-G-E, and he is he's a little gimmicky in ways, but he's come up with steps that he has dissected from really researching the biggest hits in Hollywood, like what makes one movie do really well as opposed to another. And so he's kind of come up with this formula, and I've tweaked it a little bit, but it works pretty well for activist purposes. So the big picture, a successful story has 3 basic elements. You have a character who has a desire, and then there's a conflict. But to get kind of at the root of this, Michael Hauge created 6 steps that we are going to break down. Okay, first, I recommend actually writing these 6 steps out on a big giant piece of paper, and then you can fill in notes as you kind of brainstorm and think of your organization's needs. Okay, but first, just going to fly through them, and then we'll come back and dissect them a little bit. The setup. This is where we choose your main character, and we set up her backstory. Second is the crisis. It's that big moment in your story that happens pretty early on that forces your character to solve a problem. Or another way to think of it is it's the moment where things get so desperate that your character must do something. And this is really a turning point where her old life, her backstory couldn't continue as is. Step 3 is the pursuit, and these are the actual steps your character took in response to that crisis. And so if the crisis is a true problem, this is where she starts to fix it. Next is conflict. So your hero is moving forward in her journey, but she needs to face conflicts because that's reality. You want to give your audience the emotional experience of solving problems they are likely to face and likely worrying about. Remember, the brain is using story to navigate reality. It's not realistic to not run into conflicts or problems, and especially with the work you're doing, it's not realistic to tell a happy, feel-good story. There will be conflict that you should show your audience. 5 is the climax, and that is the peak. That's when your character overcomes a final obstacle, and that leads into kind of the aftermath, which is the after picture. And like I said, you might not be telling very happy stories with what you're doing, but you can show how something has changed for your character, hopefully for the better, because they maybe found your organization or they were helped by your organization in some way. Now, to illustrate the steps, I'm going to share a very light-hearted personal career story. But I just also want to say that I recognize that this is a little bit trite compared to the stories that you're going to be telling, but I'm just doing this honestly as an example. And I don't have a slide for this, so if you want to show my face, Sarap and Giannina, go for it. Otherwise, I'm just going to dive in so I don't lose any time. So I have always loved acting, even as a small child. I was doing it in Virginia a little bit and in DC where I worked, and I always kind of thought I wanted to move to New York at some point. So one day in July of 2009, I packed up my U-Haul and I moved myself to New York, and I did not have a job. It was not my wisest moment, but nonetheless, I was here. So there I am. So I was here. And when I first got here, I temped and I found odd jobs here and there. And then by November, I started working with George Soros as his assistant. And I thought, oh, this is great. I'm the number 3 assistant. I'm just going to be opening mail and doing answering emails and the hate mail and the fan mail. And then I'll act. I'll act when I'm not at my job because I do need to make money. So I settled into my new life and I was excited to try to balance, but it wasn't the case, and the job very quickly became my life, and I had almost no time to do acting and writing. So I eventually made the tough choice to leave George and to leave really important, great work. And I went to a less time-consuming job as an assistant at an awful, awful private equity firm that was really my lowest point. I have never felt so objectified and worthless in my work. So needless to say, my creative energy did not flourish as I thought it would. I thought I would have time and energy, but instead was depressed and struggling. And around that time, a friend from college said, hey, I work for Gloria Steinem, which I knew, and I'm going to move back to Virginia. Are you interested in the job? It's part-time. And I thought, I don't know if I can make it work financially, but I'm desperate and it felt right. Plus, I wanted to work with Gloria. So I did. And when I wasn't working with Gloria part-time, I was acting and writing. I was doing more than I had before, but you know, a lot of the amateur pieces that I was getting were very male-centric and unprofessional. And I remember going to one audition in some really dingy walk-up in New York, and there was a script, which was more than many. And I didn't have to take my clothes off. That was another plus. I felt like I was auditioning for his fantasy. Like and that's what so many pieces felt like. They felt like a man's fantasy world that he wants to produce. I can't tell you how many times I have to check will not do nudity on an audition form. And I just hit this place where I thought, is this what my life is going to be like as an actor? Then I was in an off-Broadway play, and Gloria and I were in a cab in Midtown, and I was telling her about the show, and she wanted to come see it. But the play was horrible. Horribly written, produced, directed, everything, and I was very embarrassed. And I said, no way, you're absolutely not allowed to come to this show, and this is why. And as I was expressing my frustration at the men who were the directors and writers and not managing it well, and this is not to say there are not talented men out there, it's just what I was experiencing, they naturally cast themselves in the roles when they shouldn't have. And I said in my rant, I could do a better job. And she said, you should. And it was in that cab that it struck me, of course I should. And of course I could. And after that cab ride, something clicked. I went into creating my own work mode. I created a production company with a really close friend, and we still are close, and we still work together. We paid a lot of our own money to make this baby a thing, and we were doing it, and we've been doing it. And then, you know, you hit that point when you're creating your own work that it becomes a little bit of a burden financially. And that was recently for me. I decided, you know, I don't know if I have it in me to continue the acting work. And decided to take a trip to visit a friend in rural Pennsylvania, and she too was an actor and very talented, but she got tired as well. And she decided to leave New York because she was tired of feeling like her weight was the reason she wasn't getting work. She was tired of not being cast in anything. She was tired of not doing what she loved and doing a job that she had to do to pay for her insurance, health insurance in the US, of course. And we were sitting by the campfire in rural Pennsylvania reading a new script, a script by a woman who's very talented. And it was about two women who are not in conflict with each other, but are experiencing life together and supporting each other, which is so rare to have a play with two women-only characters and to have them not fighting. And I wanted to produce this play so badly. I wanted to be one of these characters so badly. And that, at that moment in that campfire, I forgot all the obstacles. I forgot everything, all those crummy auditions, and I realized I want to make a play festival. I want to make a woman-run, all women's new works play festival in Brooklyn. And that means I need to raise some funds. So back to my screen in a minute here. Mediocre PowerPoint skills coming back. Okay. So if we take my very, like I said, quick example, who's my audience? Donors. I need to put my story into better written terms because I want to attract donors. The purpose is to raise money to start a women's play festival. So let's go back to the three basic elements: character, desire, conflict. The very general broad story I want to tell is women want equality in the crappy entertainment industry. But that general phrase, though true and it resonates with people, is not going to produce as much empathy as a specific narrative will. And so to get that, I went to the 6 steps that we mentioned before. And I want to have time for questions, so I'm going to kind of fly through this. The setup. This is the most important step because you are choosing your main character. And all stories revolve around a protagonist. And everything that happens in your story will get its meaning and emotional weight from this character. Because when you listen to a character-driven story, your brain immediately floods with oxytocin. Or take the storytelling animal quote below. Functional MRI studies reveal that when we're reading or hearing a story, our brain activity isn't that of an observer but of a participant, what I mentioned before. our brain wants to follow a narrative. So how do you choose your protagonists? For a women's shelter, for example, it's pretty clear you would likely choose a woman who has benefited from the shelter services and now is doing well. If we go back to Women Refugee Route, which has a few character options for good stories. It could be one, its founder and leader, Mina, who is a refugee herself. She could tell her story like I've just told mine. You could choose a refugee woman, or you could, a third option, you could choose a fellow activist who has been through their training program. This is an example where choosing your character really depends on your purpose. And that is very organization specific and something you and your team would have to really talk about and decide. And if it means talking about a woman that you have helped, like if Mina and Roxanne and her team chose to tell the story of a refugee woman that they've helped, they would then have to do some case studies and interview a woman and get her permission and make sure that they get all of the information from this character, for lack of a better word, so that they can truly tell her story. So now that we have our character, let's pretend you've got yours in your head already. A story, remember, shows us how a person grapples with a problem or a conflict and how she changes in the process. But you can't show the change unless you know where she's come from. And that's the second part of the setup and why you have to do those interview questions or case studies, because you need to explain the backstory of your character. The backstory builds an emotional connection to our character, our vehicle, through the emotional circumstances we're about to go through. Okay, so back to my story, which again is a very simple example. It was obvious that the character should be me. I want to do the festival, and I had a very specific reason for it. Now, the backstory is a little tricky because you have to consider how far back do I go. If I was acting this story out, I would go all the way back. I'd get very specific. But for our purposes, we don't need to go that far back. We just need to go to the bigger picture and think what the character's life was like before that moment, that crisis, that everything changed. For me, that crisis, that moment, that thing that happened that interrupted my day-to-day life so I couldn't continue with it anymore, as it is, was that dumb play. So once I know that crisis, I know that's going to be the point where things change for me as a character, I can go back to my backstory and say, I don't need to go back to when I taught English in Korea or when I went to college. I can focus on the time when I was unhappy, losing hope in acting, and about to quit, and why. So backstory, very quickly, you can come back to this. These are just prompts to help you kind of think of good questions to fill in backstory for your characters. You're basically putting yourself in that character's shoes, and you have to figure out what her life is like. Okay, but back to the 6 steps so we can get to my favorite part, the Q&A, because I'm curious to hear from you all. For me, the pursuit are the steps to the goal of trying to figure out if I want to continue acting, right? Like if I'm going to start this production company and produce my own work, right? So I have to get to that climax. Conflict and pursuit go hand in hand. So while I'm talking about the steps I'm taking, like starting a production company, I might include, as I did, it costs money to start a production company, and that was hard. You know, we produced a web series, which was excellent, but it took a lot of our time, and we were very burnt out. Okay, speeding through, climax. The climax for my story was that campfire moment. It was that aha, that peak of my story when I knew the resolution was in sight, the aftermath. I knew that I would continue acting because of that moment by the campfire when I read this piece that I loved that brought me back to kind of my own creative purposes in life. Then the aftermath, which can be a little bit hard for the stories you're telling. The aftermath is where your character ends up. And after she's decided to live differently, where is she? And for a lot of your stories, the aftermath may not be rosy, like I've said. It may still be happening, and you might not be able to tell that much. Like my story, it's in the works. But you do need to give people some sense of success, or you need to say, with your help, we could get more success, to kind of bring it together, because people do want resolution. Remember, stories are our way of making sense of the world. Okay, so before we open up to questions, and I'm sorry I had to kind of speed through that last part, I just want to say thank you again for tuning in, and thank you for the work you do, because I really can't thank you enough for being on the ground doing the hard work. I hope this gave you some ways to at least start thinking about incorporating storytelling into your work. And, you know, I think we can do questions now, because I really want to hear from you. Oh, very
awesome, Laura.
I also just want to, I forgot this. You can come back to this, everyone, but here are references. I hope, like I said, that you're able to read some of these books, because they really were fascinating, and everyone should read them.
Perfect, Laura. That was awesome, so useful, and so many practical tips. We really appreciate it. Laura, we have a couple of questions that they're really interesting. The first one is, somebody asked, what about a story without a conflict? How you deal with something like that? Hello?
Sorry, I lost you. I heard, what about a story
without a conflict?
Can the person give an example?
Well, let's...
let me try to think. So I would say if it's something like hyper-realist. Hyper-realists are like, oh, let's just tell the day in a life of this person. That's interesting in and of itself. And yes, that is interesting. If you I can't think of a great example that is really interesting to me, though, because I would argue that the stories that really stick in our minds are the ones that start with a character, like I've said, and then something has to happen to that character. And so conflict doesn't have to be negative, but it needs to be a change. Because if something doesn't change, we're not learning. We want to learn from a story.
Exactly.
Even if you look at reality TV, which is not reality, as we all know, they have writers because they have to create that for their characters. They have to create that change and movement for the characters, because ultimately we're not going to just, I mean, I'm certainly not just going to watch someone sitting in their mansion eating Doritos. You know, I need something to change and happen. But if they think of an example, I'd love to expand on that, because that is a good question.
Right. So the second question is from Marion. She said, we often find that policymakers are very keen to have statistics and concrete examples from all of us as civil society. How can we balance that request with storytelling?
That's a great question.
Hi, Marion.
That is an excellent question, and that is something I actually talked to Saurabh about, because I wanted to understand culturally as well. Are you expected, when you stand in front of a minister, to just give statistic after statistic? And yes, that might be the norm. But I have a feeling that most of the people here don't care too much about the norm or the way it's supposed to be. and would be able to find ways to weave story in while also giving statistics. So let's say you start with your statistic. Maybe that's these are the statistics you want to highlight. How can you build a story around those facts? And then how can you do so in a way that is also accepted by ministers or, you know, civil servants that expect it to be a certain way? And I have to say I would need EWL's help a little bit with that, because I do find that in the US we are more casual in those kinds of presentations. So I'm coming from a slightly different perspective, but I would say with some one-on-one coaching with your points that you want to make, Marianne, you could find a way to tell a story. But I think that's a great idea for a workshop, because I really thought this could be a challenge for the expectations you all have in this kind of a setting.
Great, Laura. We have a lot of questions left, so we only have like 7 minutes, so let's try to put them all.
I'll fly through. That was a really good question, though. I had to expand because it's something.
Don't worry. The next one is from Roxanne, and she says, how do you avoid the story of an individual is overshadowing the work or needs of the organization? For example, Mina will always stay the refugee girl and is not rewarded as the founder and entrepreneur behind their work. When do you need to cut the personal story for the good of the NGO and then the person herself?
When do you need to what the story? That last, I just didn't hear that last word.
Yeah. When do you need to cut the personal story for the good of the NGO and the person herself?
I mean, honestly, what I think my immediate reaction is you just have to add to your story list. You need to get more stories so that, I mean, you never want to feel, that's another thing I thought about a lot, you never want to feel like you are putting a flashlight on someone's life and exposing making them so vulnerable, and you're doing it so that it's for the bigger cause. So the way to kind of work around that so that Mina's not always the face, and we kind of deal with this with Gloria a lot, you highlight other stories. You know, people think Gloria's the only feminist out there, which couldn't be further from the truth, which means we as feminists need to get more of those stories out there so that people realize it's not just Mina doing this work. It's not just Mina and the work she is doing. This is how it's affecting these other people, and they have interesting stories too. Did that answer it? You there? Well, I hope that answered it. Roxanne, okay.
That was a great answer, actually. We have another one for Simon. He asked, how do we capture people's attention quickly enough to want to listen to a whole story?
Yeah, so that's something that I really think activists have to be very aware of. I was listening to a podcast this morning about poetry versus novels. I fall more in the novel category, and I am not efficient with my words and the way a poet is. And so I think what you have to do is on that big piece of paper I said, with those steps, you have to brainstorm and write it all out, but then you have to be very picky about editing it. And it really is a subjective question to a certain degree. How much of the backstory do you tell to hook people? I mean, if I was doing, say, it also depends on the medium. If you're doing a Facebook post, I think you give 2 or 3 sentences about that person, that character, to introduce that character, and then right away you go into the climax, because that climax, that the crisis, sorry, I'm confusing my C's, that crisis is the point where people get hooked, and that crisis is that moment when your brain goes, oh, if I was in that situation, what would I do? So you want to get to the crisis quickly, but you also do need that backstory, because you need the person to feel emotionally involved. If you watch a movie, the next movie you watch, with characters, of course, not necessarily documentary. They have characters too. Anyway, see how long it takes you to feel something for that character. If it's 30 minutes in, it's too much. People need to feel connected, and if you write and you're really efficient with your words and choose good information from those case studies, you can build empathy quickly. It's a good question, though. It's hard. I also think one quick addition, don't do this alone. Have people that you work with on storytelling. So get editors, get teammates to weigh in, because maybe they say, oh, I have a different experience. I don't think that part of the backstory matters at all, and it's important to collaborate.
Awesome, Lara. We have three. We unfortunately can take only 3 more questions, which means like Christine, Abdul, and Nicole. So other question, maybe we can just address it to social media with the hashtag #HerStory and other channels. So yeah, the question of Christine comes next. She asks, how about giving the story back to the beneficiaries themselves? Can we make a story about how their stories influence others people too, as well as the positive feedback from donors?
Absolutely. So if I understand that question correctly, it's like, okay, let's say we have the women's shelter, and those stories, if you get them, all those stories together, you can then tell a story about how those stories have affected the donors or other people, correct?
Exactly.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's brilliant, because I think too it goes back to empowering women. So if so many women that are underserved do not feel like they have a voice, and as soon as people feel like they have a voice or that they are affecting other people, there's this great documentary, I don't know if it's still on Netflix, I think it's called something as simple as Happy. And one of the things we need, because we are social animals, is to feel like we are helping others. So by telling those stories, those women are empowered, and then your donors also are empowered. I mean, it's just like a very symbiotic relationship, absolutely. I think that's a great project for so many organizations.
Amazing. Now we have like a question from Abdul. He says, some culture stories are much appreciated like in Western culture, but in Eastern culture, people become vulnerable if they share the stories. Do you have any thoughts about that?
A good thought. So I guess my question back to Abdul would be, so what stories are being told? You know, when you go to the movies and it's not, you know, a Hollywood Western film, what stories do you hear? I mean, because I understand not feeling like you can divulge information, but without that emotional connection, I don't think there's any story that's really powerful. So if people are sensitive about sharing their stories, in a practical sense, maybe it just means you have an anonymous narrator or character, like you don't reveal that person's name, and you create trust between you and that person. But that's a tough one that I'm not 100% sure about, and I'd have to think about a little more and maybe do more research. And if Abdul wants to, you know, email or find me on Facebook and send me examples of stories that are being told, I'm happy to kind of pull it apart. And they might be divulging more information than you realize, because that is kind of the You there?
Okay, so our last question is from Nicole. Nicole said, could you share your thoughts on the feminist ethics of, for the lack of a better term, instrumentalizing someone's life to tell the story for the purpose of getting funding or increasing our audience, particularly in the story will be about someone from a marginalized group.
Absolutely. No, that's something even if I had more time, I was going to touch on it. Because first of all, I don't think I'm not, when I say character, I'm not talking for anyone's purposes in this room probably of creating a fictional character or lying to your donors. So then how do you take someone's story that is not your own? And it's kind of like that flashlight thing, like you don't want to manipulate the person and their story to use for the bigger cause, because that's not right either. My gut tells me that the very first thing to do is to be honest and to ask the question. So if you are, let's say, Mina or Roxanne, you don't tell someone's story without their involvement, their personal contribution. Some people want to tell their story. You know, they might want to be anonymous, and if they're involved in it, they feel, again, like they're part of a community. But if they didn't get the okay, I would say you don't tell that story. You do have to go find another story, which is often why people do in nonprofits tell the story of their founder or their organizer, because it's just easier. I didn't have to get anyone's permission, except for my partners. And you know, I had to tell her, I'm going to mention you in this webinar, but it's my story, so I didn't have to get permission from anyone. And so it is a fine line. And I do think we don't want to use story just to get money. I think if you think of it that way, even though I said it very, very clearly, I think what helps is to think more of, if I have permission to tell this story, and this is a story that needs to be told, if I really get people to connect, if I do it because I love this story and I love this cause and I want people to feel passionate, then the money will come. So maybe the goal in your head is not, I'm telling the story to get money, because I too struggle with that. Maybe more of it is, I just feel like this story needs to be told. But it is a very fine line, and it's one that should be on your mind, because that means you're a good person. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Laura. Can you repeat again your email and your social media when people cannot have the chance to make you a question? Just
let me just pull it up. You see it?
Perfect. Yes, we see it.
All right. Find us, Elephant Productions, or those are my two personal Twitters and Instagram handles.
Great.
Wonderful. Yes, Laura, thanks a million. I'm so happy that it became reality, our conversation. I'm really so glad, and I learned a lot, I have to say. Learning never ends. Thank you so much. And also thanks to everybody who was participating, listening, and asking really very interesting and good questions.
Yeah.
And also, yes, so, and we, as you all know, we do that twice a year, webinars on how we can improve our funding, funders, relationships, and so on and so forth. So we're going to have very soon another one again. But however, now I wanted to know from you, Janina, what is going to happen next? Thanks a million again, Laura.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Well, what is happening is, like, this is a record webinar, so you will be able to go to our website, our social media, and our YouTube channels, and know more about this webinar, taking notes for like all the amazing things that Laura teaches today, and get engaged in our Twitter at European Woman, that we're going to be sharing more thoughts and resources in this amazing art of storytelling. Thank you so much for joining us today. See you soon.
Bye.
Thanks. So maybe we could quickly talk to her. to learn and that we maybe could talk to her. I love her. I saw my Tony. She's also very smart. Okay, wait. Or maybe we just call her again. Yeah, wait. The thing is that I don't know if